November in Boston was not a season, it was a verdict. The city turned into a grayscale painting of wet cobblestones and biting wind, forcing its inhabitants to retreat behind heavy wool coats and thicker walls. For Juliet, however, there was no retreat. Her world was defined by motion, by the relentless ticking of the delivery app on her phone, and by the heavy brown paper bags she carried to doorsteps she would never be invited to cross. Juliet was 25, but her eyes held the kind of ancient exhaustion that comes from carrying the weight of a family's survival. Once, those hands had been covered in charcoal and graphite, sketching skylines she dreamed of building. She had been an architecture student with a scholarship and a future. But that was before her mother's accident, before the medical bills piled up like snowdrifts, before the scholarship was traded for 3 part-time jobs, and a life lived in the margins. Now, she was a professional ghost. She moved through the city's wealthiest zip codes, delivering organic produce and vintage wines, existing only as a notification on a screen. Your order has arrived. She was the landscape, not the portrait. That Tuesday evening, the rain was a torrential sheet, blurring the world into streaks of silver and black. Juliet's beat-up sedan groaned as it climbed the winding private road of Beacon Hill, heading toward the highest point in the district. The destination was infamous, the Hawthorne Estate. It was a place shrouded in rumors. The locals whispered about the beast of Beacon Hill, a recluse who had bought the historic mansion 3 years ago and promptly sealed it off from the world. They said he was disfigured, they said he was mad, they said he was simply a billionaire who hated humanity. Juliet didn't care about the rumors. She cared about the $5 tip surcharge for inclement weather. The iron gates groaned open automatically, sensing her arrival, and she drove up the long, dark driveway lined with weeping willows that thrashed in the wind. The house loomed ahead, a Gothic revival monstrosity of dark stone and pointed arches, looking more like a fortress than a home. There were no lights on in the windows, save for a faint, amber glow emanating from the ground floor. Juliet parked the car, the engine sputtering into silence. She took a deep breath, steeling herself against the cold. She grabbed the 4 heavy bags of groceries, artisanal breads, expensive cuts of steak, bottles of dark red wine, and stepped out into the deluge. The rain soaked her instantly, plastering her oversized gray hoodie to her skin and chilling her through her drenched jeans. She hurried up the stone steps to the massive oak front door. There was no doorbell, only a heavy iron knocker in the shape of a lion's head. She reached for it, her hand trembling from the cold and the weight of the bags. We hide our true selves in the silence, terrified that a whisper might shatter the illusion. But before her knuckles could graze the metal, a sound stopped her. It was music. Drifting through the heavy wood of the door was the sound of a piano. It wasn't just a melody, it was a storm captured in keys. It was Rachmaninoff, played with a violence and a tenderness that made Juliet's breath hitch in her throat. She knew this piece. She used to listen to it while she sketched, back when she believed the world was beautiful. The person playing wasn't just skilled, they were bleeding onto the ivory. The music spoke of a grief so profound it felt physical, vibrating through the soles of Juliet's wet sneakers. She stood there, frozen, the rain forgotten, the heavy bags cutting into her fingers. She couldn't knock. To interrupt such sorrow felt like a sacrilege. She stood entranced, listening to the crescendo of a soul screaming in a language only the broken can understand. Then, abruptly, the music stopped. A jarring, discordant crash of keys followed, as if fists had been brought down in frustration. Silence returned, heavier than before. Juliet jumped, realizing she had been loitering. She raised her hand to knock, but the door was suddenly yanked open from the inside. Declan Hawthorne stood in the threshold. He was not the elderly monster the rumors described. He was a man in his early 30s, tall and imposing, wearing a white dress shirt that was unbuttoned at the collar and rolled up to his elbows. But the first thing Juliet noticed wasn't his height or his wealth. It was the scar. A jagged, pale line ran from his temple, cutting through his left eyebrow and disappearing into his hairline. It didn't make him ugly, it made him terrifyingly real. His hair was dark and disheveled, damp with sweat, and his chest was heaving as if he had just run a marathon. But it was his eyes that pinned Juliet to the spot. They were the color of storm clouds, gray, turbulent, and filled with a defensive, feral anger. He looked at her, then at the bags in her hands, then back at her face. He seemed confused, as if he had forgotten he had ordered food, or perhaps forgotten that a world existed outside his music room. "I didn't hear the bell," Declan said. His voice was a deep baritone, rough with disuse. It wasn't an apology, it was an accusation. I didn't ring it," Juliet stammered, shivering as a gust of wind hit her back. "I heard the piano. I didn't want to interrupt." Declan stiffened. His gaze sharpened, dissecting her. He looked at her wet hair, her red, cold hands clutching the paper bags, the water dripping from her nose. He was accustomed to people looking away from his scar, or staring with morbid curiosity. But this shivering delivery girl wasn't looking at his scar. She was looking at his hands, the hands that had just created that devastating music. "You listened?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried over the rain. "It was beautiful," Juliet whispered, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. "And it was sad. For a heartbeat, time suspended." The billionaire recluse and the soaked delivery girl stood on the threshold of a fortress, separated by class, by wealth, and by the heavy oak doorframe. But in that second, the wall between them was thin. Declan didn't snatch the bags. He didn't slam the door. He looked at her with a sudden, piercing intensity, as if seeing something in her wet, tired face that mirrored his own internal wreckage. He reached out to take the bags, his fingers brushing against hers. His skin was burning hot. Hers was ice cold. The contact sent a jolt through them both, a static shock that had nothing to do with the weather. "You're freezing," Declan stated, not as a question, but as a realization. He stepped back, opening the door wider, breaking the cardinal rule of his isolation. He didn't dismiss her into the night. He did the unthinkable. "Come inside," he commanded, his eyes locking onto hers with a magnetic, dangerous pull. "Just for a moment, until the rain slows." Juliet knew she should say no. She knew the company policy. She knew the danger of stepping into the lion's den. But she looked at the man with the storm in his eyes and the scar on his face, and she realized that the cold outside was nothing compared to the warmth she sensed buried beneath his anger. She stepped over the threshold, leaving the storm behind, unaware that she was walking into a tempest far more dangerous than the one she had escaped. The heavy oak door slammed shut, severing the connection to the storm outside. The sudden silence in the grand foyer was absolute, ringing in Juliet's ears louder than the thunder. She stood on a floor of black and white checkered marble, a shivering puddle forming around her worn sneakers. The grandeur of the space was suffocating. Vaulted ceilings stretched high into the shadows, and a crystal chandelier, dim and dusty, hung like a suspended tear above them. Juliet hugged herself, conscious of how small and sodden she looked in this cathedral of wealth. She was a stain on the perfection of the Hawthorne Estate, a delivery girl dripping rainwater onto a floor that probably cost more than her mother's life insurance policy. Declan didn't seem to notice the floor. He placed the grocery bags on an antique mahogany table with a carelessness that made Juliet wince. He turned to her, his movements restless, like a tiger pacing a cage. In the electric light of the foyer, his scar was more pronounced, a stark white map of pain against his tan skin. Most people looked away. Juliet, with her architect's eye for structure and history, found herself tracing the line of it, wondering about the force that had shattered him. "Stay there," Declan commanded, his voice rough. "Don't move." He disappeared down a dark hallway, his footsteps heavy and uneven. Juliet stood frozen, afraid that if she moved, She might break something valuable. She looked around. The house was magnificent, a Gothic revival masterpiece, but it was starving. There were no flowers in the vases, no photos on the mantel. It was a house that had stopped living long ago. A house without memories is just a pile of stones waiting to fall. Declan returned a moment later, carrying a thick, navy blue cashmere towel. He didn't toss it to her. He walked up to her, invading her personal space, the heat radiating from his body combating the chill in hers. He held the towel out, but his hands hesitated, hovering near her wet hair. For a second, Juliet thought he might dry her hair himself, an act of intimacy so profound it made her breath catch. But he pulled back, the barrier of their station slamming down. "Dry yourself," he muttered, thrusting the towel into her hands. "I don't need you getting sick and suing me." The harsh words didn't match the concern in his gray eyes. Juliet took the towel. It was softer than anything she had ever touched. She buried her face in it, inhaling the scent of cedar and rain that clung to him. "Thank you," she whispered, lowering the towel. "For the shelter. And for the music." Declan leaned against the stone archway, crossing his arms protectively over his chest. He looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and hunger. "You recognize the piece. Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor." "The Bells of Moscow," Juliet answered, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "I used to listen to it when I was drafting. It starts so slowly like a heartbeat, and then it descends into chaos. It feels like building a tower just to watch it crumble." Declan went still. His eyes locked onto hers, stripping away the layers of defense he had built over years of isolation. He had expected a polite compliment. He hadn't expected her to understand the architecture of his pain. "You're an architect?" he asked, his gaze dropping to her hands that were red from the cold and rough from carrying crates. "I was studying to be one," Juliet corrected, the shame of her current reality flushing her cheeks. "Now, I just deliver groceries to the people who can afford to build the towers." "The world is full of people who build things they don't understand," Declan said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "And people who destroy things they can't replace." He reached out, almost involuntarily, and brushed a droplet of rain from the shoulder of her hoodie. The touch was light, tentative, searing. It was a microtransgression, a billionaire touching the help, a man touching a woman he had just met. Juliet stopped breathing. The air between them thickened, charged with the static of a forbidden frequency. She looked up at him, at the scar, at the storm in his eyes, and she didn't see a monster. She saw a mirror. "Why do you hide in here?" Juliet asked, the question slipping out before her fear could stop it. "With music like that, you should be heard." Declan pulled his hand back as if burned. The darkness returned to his face. "I am not hiding, Juliet. I am containing the damage." He walked over to a small side table and poured a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He didn't offer her one. He downed it in a single swallow, his back to her. The tension in his shoulders was palpable. He wanted her to leave. He wanted her to stay. The conflict was tearing him apart. "You should go," Declan said, not turning around. "The rain has stopped." Juliet looked toward the door. The drumming had indeed faded to a soft patter. She felt a sharp pang of disappointment. She folded the cashmere towel neatly and placed it on the bench. "Goodbye, Mr. Hawthorne," she said softly. "Declan," he corrected, his voice a rasp. He turned around then, looking at her with a desperate intensity. "My name is Declan." "Declan," she repeated. The name felt heavy and important on her tongue. She turned to the heavy oak door, her hand gripping the cold iron handle. But before she could turn it, a sound echoed from the top of the grand staircase. Ideally, it would have been the wind. Instead, it was the sharp, unmistakable click of high heels on marble. "Declan!" The voice was cool, polished, and demanding. Juliet froze. She looked up to the landing. Standing there, Bathed in shadows was a woman. She was older, elegant, dressed in a silk robe that looked like liquid silver. She wasn't a lover. She carried herself with the authority of a gatekeeper. "Mrs. Gable," Declan said, his posture stiffening instantly. "I was just paying the delivery." The woman descended the stairs slowly, her eyes fixing on Juliet with the cold precision of a laser. She looked at the wet sneakers, the worn clothes, the folded towel. She didn't see a person. She saw a contamination. "The delivery goes to the service entrance, Declan," Mrs. Gable said, her tone dripping with condescension. "You know the rules. No visitors. Especially not this kind." She reached the bottom of the stairs and stood between them, a physical wall reasserting the order of the world. She held out a hand, not to greet Juliet, but to point at the door. "Leave," Mrs. Gable commanded, "and do not come back to the main house. We have a reputation to maintain before the wedding." The wedding. The word hung in the damp air like a guillotine blade. Juliet looked at Declan. He didn't deny it. He didn't look at her. He looked at the floor, shame burning his neck, trapped by a duty she couldn't comprehend. He wasn't just a recluse. He was a man spoken for. The connection they had shared, the music, the touch, the understanding, was instantly strangled by the reality of his obligations. Juliet felt the fool. She pushed the door open and ran out into the drizzle, the warmth of the foyer vanishing instantly, replaced by the biting cold of the truth. She was just the delivery girl, and he was a man who belonged to a world that would never let him go. The days following the encounter were a blur of gray numbness. Juliet tried to convince herself the connection was a hallucination, but the unpaid bills on her counter were real. She blocked the Hawthorne address, refusing to cross that line again. But poverty is a cruel master. 3 days later, her app pinged. A priority order with triple pay, enough to cover her mother's medication for a month. The address wasn't the mansion, it was the Hawthorne Vance Foundation. Fate, it seemed, wasn't done with her yet. Out of hundreds of drivers, the algorithm chose her. She accepted. She had to. At the service loading dock, the air smelled of expensive hydrangeas and tension. Head down, cap pulled low, Juliet pushed crates of sparkling water toward the kitchen. Through the swinging doors, she froze. The ballroom was suffocatingly grand. In the center stood Declan. He looked like a prisoner in a bespoke suit, his scar stark against his pale skin. Beside him was Alara Vance, the heiress, the bride. Juliet felt a physical blow. It wasn't a rumor. It was a merger of empires. She turned to flee, desperate to escape, but collided with a hard chest in the corridor. Strong hands steadied her. "Juliet!" Declan breathed. He looked at her worn hoodie, then at the ballroom, his eyes filled with shame. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, pulling her into the shadows. "Mrs. Gable, if she sees you." "I'm working, Declan," she said, pulling away. "Someone has to deliver the water for your toast." "It's not a wedding," he hissed, desperate. "It's a contract. Her father holds the debt on the estate. Marrying her is the only way to keep the house, to keep the piano, to keep the only place where I can breathe. You're selling your soul for a pile of stones," Juliet whispered, heartbreaking. "You're building a prison and calling it a home." "I have no choice," he said, stepping closer, cupping her face with trembling hands. "I only play for the people who really hear me." "I played for you, Juliet." The proximity was intoxicating. For a second, the debt and the bride didn't exist. But then, Declan. Mrs. Gable's voice cracked like a whip. She stood with security, eyes cold. "I warned you. Trespassing and harassment." She gestured to the guards. "Remove her. And blacklist her." "No!" Declan shouted. But as the guards moved in, he didn't step forward. He looked at Juliet, then at the ballroom where his financial salvation waited. He froze, paralyzed by debt and duty. The realization shattered Juliet completely. He wasn't a beast. He was just a coward, Don't worry, Mr. Hawthorne, Juliet said, voice hollow. I know the way out. I've been invisible my whole life. She walked into the night, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind her. Inside, a cheerful waltz began to play. Outside, Juliet stood alone in the dark, leaving Declan trapped in his gilded cage. The city of Boston did not mourn Juliet's heartbreak, it simply moved on. The rain turned to sleet, the gray skies hardened into winter, and Juliet returned to the invisible rhythm of her life. She was blacklisted from the agency, just as Mrs. Gable had promised. Now, she worked the night shift at a 24-hour diner near the docks, serving coffee to strangers who looked right through her. Her sketchbook lay closed on her bedside table, the graphite untouched. She couldn't draw buildings anymore. Every time she tried to sketch a cornice or an archway, she saw the Hawthorne Estate, looming like a tombstone over her dreams. She told herself she hated him. She told herself that Declan Hawthorne was just a coward wrapped in expensive silk, a man who loved his cage more than the open sky. But hate is not the opposite of love, indifference is. And Juliet was far from indifferent. Every time a song played on the diner radio, a piano melody, a soft ballad, her chest ached with a physical sharpness that took her breath away. 2 weeks passed in this suffocating silence. It was a Tuesday night, dead quiet in the diner. Juliet was wiping down the counter, the smell of stale grease and burnt coffee clinging to her hair. The bell above the door chimed. She didn't look up immediately. "Sit anywhere," she called out, her voice flat. "I'll be with you in a minute." "I don't want coffee, Juliet." The voice was rough, familiar, and shattered the mundane reality of the diner instantly. Juliet dropped her rag. She looked up slowly, terrified that her mind was conjuring ghosts again. Declan stood in the entryway. He looked nothing like the polished groom she had seen in the ballroom. He was wearing a dark coat that was soaked through with sleet. His hair was wild, unkempt, and for the first time since she met him, he wasn't hiding his scar. He hadn't styled his hair to cover it. It stood out, a jagged line of vulnerability on his pale face. He looked exhausted, hollowed out, like a man who had been awake for a fortnight. "You can't be here," Juliet whispered, looking around the empty diner, fearing security guards or Mrs. Gable would burst in. How did you even find me?" Declan stepped closer, water dripping from his coat onto the cheap linoleum. "I checked every diner near the docks, Juliet. Every single one," he said, his voice raspy with exhaustion. "It took me 2 weeks, but I wasn't going to stop until I found you." "You shouldn't have," Juliet snapped, her defense mechanisms slamming into place to protect her heart. "You have a wedding to plan. You have a legacy to save. Go back to your castle, Declan. You made your choice in the loading dock." "I didn't choose," Declan corrected her, stopping right in front of her, separated only by the laminate counter. "I froze. There is a difference." "The result is the same," she countered bitterly. "I was thrown out like trash. You stayed." "I stayed," Declan admitted, his voice cracking. "And I went back to the party. I stood on that stage with Alara. I raised a glass. I smiled for the cameras. And then I went home." He reached into his coat pocket. Juliet flinched, expecting money, a payoff to silence her. But he pulled out a single, heavy iron key. It was old, rusted, and looked like it belonged to a dungeon. "Do you know what this opens?" Declan asked, placing it on the counter between them. Juliet shook her head, mesmerized by the intensity in his storm-cloud eyes. "It opens the music room," he said softly. "After you left, I tried to play. I sat at the piano. I wanted to play Rachmaninoff. I wanted to feel that anger, that passion again. But I couldn't." He looked down at his hands, the hands of a virtuoso, as if they were useless tools. "Silence," he whispered. "That's all there was. I couldn't hear the music anymore. The house, the stones I was trying so hard to save, they sucked the sound right out of the air. I realized then that the estate isn't a legacy, Juliet. It's a mausoleum, and I was burying myself alive in it. A house without love is just a pile of stones waiting to fall. So what are you doing here? Juliet asked, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. I'm here to tell you the truth, Declan said, looking up at her. The scar. Everyone thinks it was a car accident. Or a fight. It wasn't. He touched the jagged line on his temple. It happened when I was 20. My father found me playing the piano instead of studying the market reports. He threw a crystal decanter at me. He told me that emotions were a weakness, that art was a waste of time. He told me I had to be iron to survive in this family. Juliet gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. The violence of his past explained the fortress of his present. I spent my whole life trying to be iron, Declan confessed, tears welling in his gray eyes. I locked myself in that house to prove I could protect it. But when you walked in, when you listened to me play, the iron melted. And now I would rather bleed than be numb for one more second. Declan, Juliet breathed, reaching across the counter. She couldn't help it. She placed her hand over his. He didn't pull away this time. He gripped her fingers, as if she were the only thing keeping him from drowning. I called off the wedding, he said. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Juliet stared at him. But the debt? The house? They will take it, Declan said, a strange, terrifying peace settling over his face. The bank will seize the Hawthorne Estate on Monday morning. I am losing everything, Juliet. The paintings, the furniture, the history. I will be bankrupt. I will be nothing. He squeezed her hand, but I realized something in the silence. I can live without the house. I can live without the money. But I cannot live without the music. And the music, it only exists when I'm with you. It was a terrifying declaration. He had burned his kingdom to the ground for a chance to stand in the ashes with her. He wasn't offering her a life of luxury. He was offering her a life of ruin, but a life that was real. You gave up everything? Juliet asked, her voice trembling. I gave up the things that didn't matter, Declan replied. He looked around the cheap diner, at the fluorescent lights and the peeling paint. This place, it has more warmth than my entire mansion. He looked at her, vulnerable and exposed, a king without a crown. I have nothing to offer you now, Declan whispered. No estate, no security, just a man with a scar and a pair of hands that want to play for you. Is that enough? Juliet looked at him. She saw the fear in his eyes, the fear that he was too broken, too late. But she also saw the courage it took to walk away from the only safety he had ever known. She realized that he hadn't just left the cage, he had destroyed it. She walked around the counter. She didn't care about the manager, or the customers, or the world that said they didn't belong together. She stood in front of him, reaching up to gently touch the scar on his temple, the mark of his pain, the map of his survival. You are not nothing, Declan, she whispered. You are the music. Declan let out a shuddering breath and pulled her into his arms. He buried his face in her neck, holding her tightly, shaking with the relief of finally letting go. They stood there in the harsh light of the diner, two people stripped to their defenses, clinging to each other in the wreckage of his former life. The reconciliation had begun, not with a grand gesture of wealth, but with the brutal, beautiful honesty of loss. He had lost the world, but as he held her, he realized he had finally found his home. There was still the matter of the foreclosure, the scandal, the uncertain future. But for tonight, the silence was broken, and in the quiet hum of the diner, a new melody began to play. The sun rose over Beacon Hill on Monday morning, not with a triumphant fanfare, but with a quiet, pale gray light that exposed every crack in the pavement. At 8 a.m. sharp, the black town cars of the bank executives lined up outside the iron gates. Men in suits, carrying clipboards and keys, swarmed the property like ants dismantling a fallen giant. Declan and Juliet stood on the opposite side of the street, watching. Declan was no longer wearing a bespoke suit. He wore a simple wool sweater and jeans, standing with his hands deep in his pockets. He watched in silence as the movers carried out the antique furniture, the paintings, and finally, the grand Steinway piano. It took 4 men to lift the instrument, maneuvering it awkwardly through the front door. For a moment, it tilted dangerously. Juliet felt Declan flinch beside her, a phantom pain for the instrument that had been his only voice. But he didn't step forward. He didn't shout. He stood rooted to the sidewalk, a spectator at his own funeral. "You could have fought for the piano," Juliet whispered, slipping her hand into the crook of his arm. "The lawyers said you could keep personal effects." Declan didn't look away from the mansion, the gothic monstrosity that had loomed over the neighborhood like a threat for years. "It doesn't fit in the new apartment," he replied, his voice calm and devoid of bitterness. "Besides, that piano only knows how to play sadness. I think it's time for a new instrument." Just then, Mrs. Gable emerged from the house carrying a single box. She paused when she saw Declan across the street. For a fleeting second, the old housekeeper looked as if she might approach, perhaps to offer a final scolding or a shred of pity. But then she saw Juliet standing beside him, the delivery girl who had toppled an empire, and her face hardened into stone. She turned her back, got into her car, and drove away without a wave. The severance was complete. The beast of Beacon Hill was officially evicted. We build our castles high so no one can see that the rooms inside are empty. Declan turned away from the house and looked at Juliet, the wind catching her hair, her eyes bright with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked. "Home," Juliet repeated, testing the word. "It's a 4th-floor walk-up with a leaky faucet, Declan." He smiled, and for the first time, the scar on his temple didn't look like a wound. It looked like a badge of honor. "It sounds like a palace." 6 months later, the city of Boston had moved on. The Hawthorne Estate was sold to a foreign developer, and the rumors about the recluse faded into urban legend. But in a small, vibrant neighborhood in Somerville, life was loud, messy, and undeniably real. The apartment was exactly as Juliet had described, cramped, drafty, and filled with the smell of turpentine and simmering tomato sauce. The living room was dominated not by a grand piano, but by a battered, second-hand upright Declan had found in a pawn shop. It was out of tune, and one of the keys stuck in humid weather, but Declan played it every night. He didn't play for an empty hall anymore. He played for Juliet while she sketched at the small kitchen table. She was no longer delivering groceries. With the money she saved and the emotional weight lifted, she had re-enrolled in architecture school. Her designs had changed. She no longer drew towering glass spires or cold stone fortresses. She drew homes, spaces designed for light, for connection, for noise. On a rainy Tuesday evening, the anniversary of the night they met, Juliet sat on the floor, leaning against the leg of the piano as Declan played. He wasn't playing Rachmaninoff. He was improvising a soft, wandering melody that sounded like rain against a window pane. He stopped, letting the final chord hang in the air, vibrating through the wood and into her spine. "It's not perfect," Declan murmured, running his hand over the scratched keys. "The sound, it's smaller here." Juliet turned to look up at him. "It's not smaller. It's closer." In the mansion, the music had to travel through so much empty space just to reach the walls. Here, it touches everything instantly. Declan looked down at her. The shadows under his eyes were gone. His hands, once clenched in perpetual anger, were relaxed. He slid off the bench and sat on the floor beside her, pulling her into his lap. "I used to be terrified of the silence," he confessed, resting his forehead against hers. "I thought that if the music stopped, I would disappear. That I was just a ghost haunting my father's house." Juliet reached up, tracing the line of a scar. "And now," Now I know that the silence is just space for you to speak, he whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It wasn't a deed or a check. It was a sketch Juliet had made on a napkin during one of their first nights in the apartment. It was a drawing of Declan, not as the billionaire, but as he was now, messy hair, sleeves rolled up, laughing over a burnt dinner. You captured me, he said, holding the sketch up to the dim light. The world saw a monster. You saw this. Juliet smiled softly. We shattered the illusion, Declan. And we're still standing. He kissed the ink-stained tips of her fingers. We're not just standing. We're building. You on paper and me on these keys. They sat there as the rain drummed against the window, a sound that used to signal loneliness, now a cozy rhythm of their shared life. There were no servants to dismiss, no gates to lock, no legacy to uphold. Declan Hawthorne had lost a fortune to gain a life. He looked at Juliet, the architect of his redemption, and realized he was the richest man in the city. Play it again, Juliet whispered against his lips. The Rachmaninoff? He shook his head. No, the new one. The one that sounds like coming home. As the music filled the small, imperfect room, the ghosts of the past finally faded away. He had spent his life behind a fortress of stone, believing he was unlovable, until a delivery girl in the rain taught him that the only things worth keeping are the ones you cannot buy, and the only love worth claiming is the one that sets you free.